In the great pantheon of New World explorers, no name is more intriguing or clouded in controversy than that of St. Brendan of Ireland. His legend has persisted through centuries in the form of the Navigatio, an Irish saga which details Brendan's journey to the land of the saints far beyond the Atlantic. Known as the Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatis, the voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot was written in 800 AD and was widely copied and read during the Middle Ages. The Navigatio is an allegorical tale, which once deciphered gives all the clues and landmarks on how to reach North America. Clues which begin with a visit with the revered St. Enda on the Aran Islands, who inspires Brendan's transatlantic journey along the northern route through the Island of Sheep, the Paradise of Birds, and the great crystal columns in the sea we know to be icebergs. Next, Brendan encounters Iceland's volcanoes, which lofts hot rocks at them. Then it's on to Greenland and Newfoundland some 400 years before Leif Erikson and the Vikings reach North America. There the monks experience large numbers of curious whales, and as folklore has it, celebrate a mass on one of them known as Jaconius. With this kind of geographic and marine detail in the Navigatio, it's no wonder early cartographers and explorers gave credence to the Brendan legend and annotated their maps accordingly. Even the Viking sagas describe encounters with Irish monks along the northern route, and Christopher Columbus's diary mentions visits to Galway in 1472 to study the Brendan legend. And now there may be archaeological proof that the land of the saints could be North America.
I was born in County Kerry in 489 AD in a seafaring village not far from our island of pearls and a vast ocean beyond. I was meant for special hands at birth. At one, I was placed with St. Ita of Killeedy, who took charge of my ecclesiastic epiphany. Killeedy was our home amid the beautiful Kerry countryside. There I learned charity, a simple life, and a steadfast belief in Him.
Yes, St. Brendan was educated by Navigator, or St. Ita. During his very early years, from what I can find out, that from the age of just 1, he was fostered with St. Ita. But then fosterage was a very common occurrence with the old Irish families during the early Christian period and even up until fairly recent times. And he stayed with her until I think he was about 5, and then he moved on to further his studies elsewhere.
My baptism in the faith came under the watchful eye of St. Ida in a little pasture well not far from Clonfert. After learning the rudiments of a dedicated life from Ida, Bishop Burke of Kerry took an interest in me. Years of study in his sanctuary manifested itself into a worthy and steadfast disciple.
We are here in Anna Churchyard, just west of Tralee in the County Kerry. It's the place deeply associated with St. Brendan, the great navigator. The Christian records of the Diocese of Kerry show our first bishop to have been Erc. Now, Bishop Erc was the first bishop of Kerry who met St. Patrick and was consecrated bishop by him. We believe that Bishop Erc baptised Brendan, later ordained him a priest and probably consecrated him as bishop. That all happened 1,400 years ago, a long time ago, but it's remarkable how much has survived, how much knowledge has survived, not just in legend, but also in the various monuments, inscriptions, ring forts, and the ruins that you find in this area.
With Bishop Erc's assistance, I framed my own monastic rule. Upon ordination, I gathered some brethren and settled on land just 5 miles from my birth in Clonfert. Our genuine love of new learning brought us fame and followers. From Clonfert, my thoughts turned to the hermit life. This simple existence exalted God and His work and brought us solace and peace. Many followed and camped by our sparse stone huts, just inside the little hill forts, with a modest church of stone and a workshop close by.
We're standing in a group of beehive huts, or clochán, in the townland of Glenfawn on the Dingle Peninsula, which is the area from which St. Brendan sailed, somewhere on the Dingle Peninsula. And these hut sites, or houses, would have been the types of houses that people lived in during the early Christian period, right up to the coming of the Vikings and probably to the coming of the Normans. And monks were people, just like everybody else, and they would have lived in houses very similar to these. But in a case like Brendan's, just one little house on its own, because St. Brendan lived during the very, very early period after the coming of Christianity to Ireland, when the whole notion of monasticism was still only developing. So some of the holy men of that period would have lived more as hermits. But again, the type of house they would have lived in would probably have been something like this. They're built using the corbelling technique, so that the stone walls rise to a certain height, and then they start joining in. The stones are laid one on top of the other, so that eventually you would have a stone roof. Studies have been done on this, examining excavated results from all over Ireland, and it has been found that the most common type from the earlier period is the round house, and then the rectangular house becomes more common during the later period. There are a number of features in these round houses that are quite commonly seen. In this one here we have a little wall niche, which is just a simple little shelf, cupboard space, where a utensil or several utensils might have been put when cooking was being done. And the hearth, or cooking place, the fireplace, would probably have been centrally placed within the house, and there may well have been a small hole in the roof from which smoke would have escaped. Another feature in this particular example is a small, I don't know if chamber is even the word to use down here. There's enough room, you just see the doorway here, but if you go into it, there's a small area where a person could lie kind of crouched in the fetal position, perhaps as a form of shelter, to rest maybe. It's not a passageway, it doesn't lead any further. And there are a couple of examples of these in the houses on the peninsula, but they're not terribly common. So it is more than likely that Brendan would have lived in a house similar, certainly in shape, to this.
My monastic quarters embraced scholarship and art. Styles were a rich blend of old Irish motifs, Ogham, and a mix of Hebrew, Greek and Latin. We adorned our cells and settlements, both here and in the New World, with Christian kairos and Ogham writings in reverent belief and to mark our place for others.
When we're talking about St. Brendan and all of the things that perhaps induced the Irish to come across, one of the great books that we find that has been preserved that the Irish monks did, it's called the Book of Ballymote. And in the Book of Ballymote, you have all the different varieties of Ogham writing. And we find that as we now deal with Ogham that are straight lines and so forth, which you might call classic Ogham, you find these monks did an enormous amount of things. They would have what's called tree Ogham, and it would be a vertical letter, and they would come down like 1, 2, 3, 4 positions on this to indicate what letter they were using. They also had ones that curved around like this. Now, St. Brendan sailed from the Dingle Peninsula in Ireland, and it is in this peninsula that you find quite a bit of Ogham. You find on stones, you find crosses, you find kairos. So very definitely the monks were involved in the production of Ogham writing.
This cross-inscribed stone is situated in Knockane, or Cumdove, which is about halfway along the Dingle Peninsula near the village of Aunaskall. It's a most interesting boulder in that there is a Maltese cross carved on the middle of it, on one side. It's undecorated on the other side. And there's also a stem coming out of it here, which more or less indicates that the boulder has been turned on its side. It actually should be this way. So it's not in its original position, and we're not really sure where that was, but it's probably not too far away from here. Another very interesting feature on this stone is this Cairo symbol. Now, what a Cairo is, it signifies the first two letters of the Greek name of Christ, which would look like XR in our alphabet. And what you have here is just that little loop of the R. That's what the symbol is. But it was a very common symbol used by early Christians, particularly in Ireland in the 6th and 7th centuries. So more than likely this stone dates from the 6th, 7th century. Another interesting feature about Maltese crosses on stones is that often here on the Dingle Peninsula, they are found on sites which may be associated with pilgrimage up Mount Brandon, which therefore is a pilgrimage in honour of St. Brendan. Well, we're in Kilshannig, which is on the very tip of the Maharees Peninsula. And the site is situated right on the sea and within view of Ilan Thanig, which is also an early Christian monastic site. Now, we're standing within a medieval church. So this site was in use right through the medieval period, but it would have also been an early Christian foundation because of the association with Shanach in the name, and also because of this cross here. This tells us that this site was an early Christian foundation. And why does it do that? Because of some of the features on the cross. It is a Latin cross with expanded terminals, but here you see the Chi-Rho symbol. And the Chi-Rho symbol is usually found on crosses which date from the 6th and 7th centuries. And it's interesting to note at Arraglen, which is more than halfway up Mount Brandon, that the cross-inscribed Ogham stone also has that little Chi-Rho symbol on it.
Now, Brendan knew Latin, and he would normally do his intellectual work in Latin. Undoubtedly, he knew Ogham. It would just be impossible to wander around the country without running into it. Ogham was something that the average person could read, just like sign markers. It was not something that you would prefer a long papyrus or document in. It was used usually for short things, and it lasted for a long time. We run into sometimes of Ogham, which is written on small things, but essentially we call it a monumental type of writing as opposed to a printed book.
Well, there are a number of scholars working on the whole question of Ogham stones in this country and why they're found in the various areas that they are found in and what they may mean. But certainly it has to be acknowledged that there's quite a concentration of them here on the Dingle Peninsula. The vast majority of Ogham stones to be found in Ireland are in the southwest of Ireland. And then when you kind of narrow it down further, there are more of them in Kerry than any other part, well, than in Cork, and more on the Dingle Peninsula if you look closer into County Kerry. And of course this concentration of 9 here in the one graveyard is quite an amount to find together. The Ogham stones here are all of the cigar-shaped type, which indicates that they come from Menard Beach, which is situated further east of here, where there's a storm beach full of these cigar-shaped stones. And these stones were often utilised as Ogham stones here on the Dingle Peninsula. A couple of the stones, including this one that I'm beside here, have crosses carved on them. The weather conditions aren't great at the moment, it's quite damp, so it's difficult to pick out exactly the features on them. But this particular stone has an inscription coming around the side here, around the top, and continuing down on the far side. Okay, the vowels are the short little notches, whereas the consonants are the longer strokes, either diagonally across the stone or on one side or other of the imaginary stem line. Because this is a roundy stone, you don't actually have a corner as is found on other Ogham stones, which acts as a stem line. So you have to imagine that there's a line running centrally along here. So the vowels would be the little notches here, and the consonants would be the stones on the marks on either side of this imaginary line.
Next, Brendan sails for the New World.
A study of languages and the new learning led us up the River Shannon to found one of my greatest monastic settlements. At my beloved Clonfert, my brother and I talked about the legends of a distant journey to the land of the saints.
We're here now in Clonfert. Clonfert is one of the most important early monastic sites in Ireland. It was founded by St. Brendan, one of the most important early saints of Ireland, and it was founded about 550, 560 after Christ. And when he died, in fact, in Annadown in County Galway, he asked to be buried here, and he is buried here. And the result is that this place became a very important place of pilgrimage. Now, we're very fortunate in having this building because it is easily the finest Romanesque building. In other words, the finest doorway of its type in Ireland. We have some 60 or 70 of Romanesque doorways, or remains of Romanesque doorways in Ireland, but this one surpasses them all. Well, Brendan founded a monastery here. He had a Galway interest, he had a Connacht interest all the time, Brendan had. So it's quite likely that he went to found a monastery close to the major river in Ireland, which would be the major navigation. So it's quite likely if he's got to come into the middle of Ireland, or he wants to, that he would put a monastery within a mile of the biggest river, which would give him access, if he wanted, back to his homeland in Kerry, over to the west where you had St. Enda, who possibly founded the first monastery in Ireland on the Aran Islands. And then if he wants to go further, as he did, because he's meant to have founded the monastery here, being told by a holy saint that there was a promised land to the west, and he should set sail for it. So he gathered 14 of his monks from here, and then headed off to America, or wherever. People who look at the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, which is the great tale dating from about 800, have noted that there's great deal of knowledge about North Atlantic in it. So it's quite possible he did go to all these places.
As I matured in faith, my need for more solitude led me on a prayer path up Mount Brandon. I settled along the way, kept a house, and built an oratory. My humble pilgrimage route soon became known to all by the sign of the Maltese cross.
This is Kilmalcather Church, the Church of St. Moelcather. But it's on a site that has very important connections with St. Brendan, in that it is the site of the gathering point for the pilgrimage up Mount Brandon. And in fact, most of the associated sites in this area are called after St. Brendan. There's a holy well called St. Brendan's Well. There's a little oratory or small church, St. Brendan's Oratory. So quite a number of the other monuments in this, I suppose, graveyard, monastic area are called after St. Brendan. So St. Moelcather disappears out of the picture very early on, and St. Brendan himself seems to take over. The church that we're standing in at the moment is a 12th century Romanesque church, and you can see there's a very fine Romanesque arch behind me here. But it is probably on the site of an earlier church or even churches, one of which may have gone back to the period of St. Brendan himself. And we know that St. Brendan, prior to his voyage in the Navigatio, came and spent time on Mount Brandon praying prior to making that journey. So it is in commemoration of that period that St. Brendan spent up there that the pilgrimage to Mount Brandon takes place.
The sea beckoned me, as did the old legends of paradise in the west. After 40 days of prayer and fasting on Mount Brandon, I gathered my monks for a visit to Enda before the long journey to the land promised of the saints.
Enda was here by the year 490, they say, 490, and he set up a monastic foundation. His vocation was at the prompting of his sister, Fanche, who was a nun. That's the tradition, and he was of a royal family from the eastern part of the country. But he came and decided to come to a remote spot, as they often did, to set up a monastic foundation. And he set up his monastery in Arran. And over there at the far end of Killénia you have Tailach Aine. Tailach or Tailach is a household, but it was one of the words they used for a monastic settlement. And in Tailach Aine you have a little church, which is also called Tailach Aine. and that is named after St. Enda. St. Enda is reputed to have been buried near the church, just to the northwest slightly of the church. And the tradition goes that 120 saints are buried from those olden times all around the Teallach. And of course, it's possible that St. Brandon or Brendan came to Arran for part of his training, or maybe to come on retreat here to form himself in the spiritual life under a master such as St. Enda. Being a navigator, it would have been very easy for him to come in here. And there are fine anchorages here. There always have been from the beginning of time. He would have had companions, and maybe Anam Chara, a soul companion or a soul friend or a spiritual advisor. It would have been very easy for him to find someone like that here on the island.
Tim Severn, who in the early 70s was a postgraduate student, his wife was an expert on medieval manuscripts. And it was she who pointed out to him that the Navigatio was totally unlike any other hagiography, that it did not retell the story of a saint who made a journey, overcame difficulties through divine intervention. He prayed, certainly, but he overcame any problems that he had encountered by human means rather than divine means. And this spurred him to take a particularly close look at the Navigatio. He decided that indeed this was a history, this was a true story. So with that evidence in hand, with the details that he was able to extract from the Navigatio, he went to Colin Moody, who was one of the best naval architects in the field of small boats, alive to this day, and he designed this vessel. And they went to the boatyards of South County Cork and had this vessel built in 1975. And he used it over the summer seasons of 75 and 76 to sail the Atlantic. The Brendan, as built by Tim Severn to Colin Moody's designs, is 32 feet in length, 8-foot beam. The structure of the vessel, it is a double gunwale of oak, which was constructed and then turned upside down. I suppose the Irish are the only people in the world who build a vessel upside down. And then placed in position along the length and breadth of the hull are 48 leather hides, which were tanned using the traditional methods of pits of water into which the chopped oak bark were placed. And the leathers placed in that then, and they absorbed the tannin from the oak bark, and the hides were turned into leather. And these were stitched in place using 26 miles of linen thread, horsehair, and black wax, which were all rolled together to give a 12-strand twine for all the world. And that, in fact, when that was all rolled down, you had another 2 miles of material by which the leathers were stitched, and then was turned right way up. The mast stepped, the sails put in place, and she was taken to Lough Derg on the River Shannon for her maiden voyages and for their training.
I'm sure that the story of Brendan is a compilation of many voyages, and indeed in the Brendan tale itself, Brendan doesn't make a single continuous journey. He goes out and then he seems to wander around, then he comes back and he goes further out. So the Navigatio, the actual text, makes it clear that it culminates, after a number of shorter voyages, it culminates in the great journey to the Promised Land. And the description of the Promised Land is very interesting. I mean, is it a sort of a dream world? There are overtones, after all, of early Celtic mythology, and many scholars earlier on, of course, said that it was simply an extension of mythology. What I think we proved was that it was, besides being something really which was a Christian variant, it was based on a lot of practical detail. Now, why do you put practical detail in a story which is essentially an allegory or a parable of Christianity. Why is that practical detail in there? Because it seems to me that this was not put in to make it authentic. It was because it was just there. It had actually happened. The sequence of the adventures of Brendan are the sequence that we encountered as we went round. In other words, the first place where they find a monastery offshore, this would be on the west coast of Scotland, monastic settlements. The island of Sheep, placed correctly as Faroes, that's the next thing that happens. Then up to the Whales. The Whales are between Faroes and Iceland. Iceland, where you have the giant throwing the hot rocks at them. The iceberg, the forest, sequence as well as episodes match. Now that is quite extraordinary, and to me, that, if you like, is the sort of the intermediate stage where you move from technologically possible, the story is uncannily accurate. We have to wait and hope that one day maybe there will be the archaeological evidence in the New World, but that would be the final proof, and it has to be there for final acceptance. That would be the only genuine way.
Brendan's settlements in the New World when we return.
When my Viking comrades and I arrived in Vinland, later known as Newfoundland, we found men, fragments of skin, bones, and stone artifacts of another people, where men walked about in white clothes, whooped loudly, and carried poles.
Excerpts like these from the Eric the Red and Norse sagas contain accounts of monk discoveries as far west as Newfoundland. In fact, some of the earliest carbon dates in these Viking settlements actually date to the Brendan period. Were the monks the first inhabitants in these simple hill forts in Lansos Meadows? The answer to this question may lie farther south in settlements in North America. One of the more elaborate stone settlements that may have served the monks' needs is a multi-occupational site in Salem, New Hampshire.
America's Stonehenge is located approximately 18 miles from the Atlantic Ocean, about 5 miles north of the Merrimack River. A tributary of the Merrimack River runs right by this hill. It's called the Spigot River. It's about a half a mile from here. And the hilltop's about 330 feet above sea level. And the main site is about 1 acre in area, surrounded by about 106 acres of land containing walls and standing monoliths. Research on the site began in 1936 by William B. Goodwin of Hartford, Connecticut. He was a retired insurance millionaire. He traveled extensively, was a researcher, historian, and a curator of a museum. When he first visited this site, he thought it was built by the Vikings. As he uncovered these stone structures, he felt that the site was not a Viking settlement, but an Irish Chaldean monk monastery. America's Stonehenge, again, may have been a multi-occupational site. The earliest evidence of the main site is a 4,000-year-old carbon date. This is when the construction may have started. The style of construction was large slabs of stone removed from the bedrock, used for roof slabs, wall slabs, and the standing stones. It's dry stone construction. No cement was used in the construction of the site. And many of the structures have a vertical wall with large roof slabs. However, there are a couple of examples of corbelling. One of them is inside the oracle chamber. It's on the east wing of the oracle chamber. And it's a style that's similar to other sites found in New England, such as Gunjewamp, but it's also quite similar to what you can find in European sites, such as in Ireland. The watch house also has a similar type of construction inside of it. These are two of the examples of perhaps later occupation of the site. This structure is called the V-hut. It has a shape of a V. It has one large roof slab on top of it, and it has a very strong resemblance to structures I've seen in Ireland called wedge tombs. The wedge tombs were shaped similar to this. The orientation is southwest, and this structure here is the only structure on the site that has a southwesterly orientation. It's facing the winter solstice sunset, and so in that regard it's similar in shape, size, and orientation to the wedge tombs of Ireland. Behind me is a structure we call the east-west chamber. It runs east and west, and it's very similar to ones found in northwestern Ireland and also in France. They run 40 to 60 feet in length, run east and west, and were used as tombs. We have found a couple examples of markings on stone that scholars and researchers have looked at. One of the type of markings we found is Ogham, and it's been found on the site on small stone tablets. These were removed back in the 1960s and 70s, put into our visitor center on display. It was in 1975 that the doctor from Harvard University looked at these stone markings. He identified the script as Celtic Ogham, and was able to interpret their meaning on a couple of these stones. America's Stonehenge may not only be a ceremonial site, but we also believe it was a calendrical site or a calendar site. Surrounding the main site, we have stones that are located outside on the perimeter that are either standing today or fallen. They're shaped like large arrowheads varying from about 5 to 9 feet in length. They align with the 4 seasons, summer, winter, spring, and fall, as well as days in between these seasons referred to as cross-quarter days. And it was important for these people to know when these time of year occurred for different, perhaps religious holidays. If they're hunters, they were interested in the migration of animals, and if they were doing any type of exchange of goods with other people, they had to keep track of time.
The will to Christianize may have led Brendan and his followers down the East Coast to the Groton, Connecticut area, where extensive stoneworks have existed for centuries.
We explored 40 days and did not come to the end of the land. The placid shores of this extended island led us to fresh water and shelter. Old stones and wildflowers were reminiscent of our native Kerry. There, we established a settlement under St. John's sign of the Eagle.
Brendan, in my mind at least, was very real. I feel that there's so much evidence that has been both ignored and ridiculed over the centuries that today, when you stop to look at the in-ground artifacts as well as the carved artifacts and the architectural artifacts, during the past 20 years, I've gone from being a high skeptic to, to a true believer.
Sir, I hear a report of a stone wall and a strong fort in it, which is newly discovered at or near Pequot. I should be glad to know the truth of it from yourself, here being many strange reports about it. John Pynchon, 1654.
This site is unique of all of the lithic or megalithic sites in New England in that there is a letter which dates from the period of the first English colonial occupation, which expresses surprise at finding extensive stonework. The significance of that is that we know that the American Indians, the Algonquin Indians, Woodland Indians who lived in this region had no tradition of extensive stonework. Hence the great surprise which was expressed in the letter. The Indian land at that time was precisely the area which was for the first time being trespassed into by white colonists. And yet that is the year that strange reports are being heard in Springfield about extensive stone walls being found in this area. What that suggests, of course, is that these walls predate the English colonial period of the mid-17th century. And if that's the case, then that would tend to reinforce a pre-English, pre-colonial provenience for these sites, which is European origin, but 1,000 years before the English.
About 15 years ago, we had a work crew here and we're just completing an excavation of this small stone chamber when one of our people, Lynn Mason by name, happened to feel under the lichen that there were some letters. And in my grouchy way, I said, "What letters?" In cleaning this off, we did it very meticulously. We found not just one, but 3 sets of letters, and interpreted these to be either R's or P's. Come to find out, interpretations of these have been, this is a Chi-Rho, this is a Rex, and perhaps this one is a Swedish rune for the sound. This place, as small and seemingly insignificant as it is, really has a tremendous amount of history to it.
What we have here are 2 Greek letter combinations. The first one is a Greek rho, The second one is a chi, or Latin X, and another rho superimposed. This particular combination on the right is called a monogram form of chi-rho. It dates from 500 to 700 AD. There are 16 known examples carved into stone in the British Isles, all of which therefore are associated with the early Christian Celtic tradition. Therefore, we have two traditions of iconography, one in stone, the 16 examples cut into stone in Ireland and Scotland and in Britain on the mainland, as well as examples that occur in the manuscripts, such as the Book of Kells. We believe that this double ring of stones here is the raceway of a milling operation. The reason we think that is because of the way the interior wall of these stones and this interior ring have been polished by grinding action in a counterclockwise direction. To date, the earliest carbon dates that have come from the Gunjawap site were found on the western perimeter of this mill ring. The median date is been dated at 480 AD, plus and minus 200. The latter, the upper bracket of that, the younger period of that, puts it well within the range of Brendan, that is to say, in 550 AD.
My grandfather brought me here when I was a 10-year-old child, and he called this the Fox Den. Nobody knows why it was ever called that, but at any rate, this is so typical of what you would see in European constructions, just from setting up standing stones at the base, as in the Boyne River area with Newgrange, and going up just waist high and then starting the corbelling. This is identical to what I've seen in Ireland and England. In researching it, we found that it's one of the most unusual chambers in all of New England, primarily because it's got all these alignments.
One of the interesting points about the Gunjawap is this window feature right here. Essentially, the sun comes through this window twice a year, that is to say on the equinox. The vernal equinox is what is of interest here, because the vernal equinox is the triggering mechanism for the most important festival cycle of the Christian year. That is to say, it tells you the paschal cycle is beginning, Easter is about to come. And these windows, their analogs in Ireland at least, acted as giant sundials to tell you what time of year it was. Now, the fact that we find a window with an equinox alignment in this part of the world is significant. The connection between this window and the oratory windows of the Gallerus Oratory and St. Brendan's Oratory is that the sun's disk shines through the windows at all three sites on the same day of the year.
The sun is in the right sunset mode and the right azimuth and elevation to shine directly from there to this stone here, begins here, and then over a period of 45 minutes works its way toward the front of the chamber to shine into the entrance to the secret side chamber. This is something that's not just accidental. The chances of its being an accidental equinox setting would be astronomical.
Our will to Christianize led us along a much-traveled ridge where rocks, caves, and streams abounded. For a time, a huge gathering of peoples became our charge.
As the seafarers, St. Brendan and his followers, came down the east coast, and they came inland, and I'd say when you look at a map, you can see that these scribes really weren't all that far inland. They were traveling a major trail known as Indian Ridge that extends from Tazewell, Virginia, through the southern boundary of West Virginia up into Kentucky. I look at the ridge tops as well as the streams. The streams are, and ridge tops, as I point out to many of my students, that these are the interstates of prehistoric time. We're located here in southern West Virginia, Wyoming County. This is the site of the Wyoming County petroglyph. This is an early Ogham site. It has been translated pertaining to the birth of Christ. It talks about Christmas Day. It even has an astronomical alignment to the winter solstice. One would ask, who really made these marks? And I can't help from thinking about St. Brendan and his voyages and his followers. I would think that the monks who made that voyage were responsible for this, mainly because of the Christian religious symbols that we have at this site. One of the identifiable symbols is this Cairo that's part of the text of the Ogham translation. And then directly below it is this early Christian symbol of piety. This is a universal symbol, this three-line figure commonly referred to as the turkey track. We see this in Canada. We see it in many sites throughout North America. Also, there's two varieties of the turkey tracks, one with the spur, and then the other type without the spur. Also, the turkey tracks appear in the Book of Ballymote. This is one of the natural fractures within the sandstone formation here. The scribe that made the marks at this site utilized this as a stem line, which they placed marks above, below, and across the stem line. This is the way Ogham normally is written or carved. This is the second Cairo that's at the Wyoming County petroglyph site. This is the most heavily indented symbol at the site, possibly wanting to make sure that if anything of this inscription has survived the elements, that they wanted to make sure that the Cairo symbol did. I guess it's a way of signing or the signature of this site. This is the symbol that I refer to as the sunburst symbol. This area, the symbols here, the symbols over here, this is the section of the petroglyph site that has been translated pertaining to the astronomical alignment. And it talks about the sun will gaze through the notch on the left-hand side at the time of sunrise, a feast day, Christmas Day. The area here that is identified as the astronomical alignment of the winter solstice, the 21st day of December. On the 21st day of December, and sometimes you have 2 days before and 2 days afterwards, that a shadow forms as the sun rises, and the shadow forms, and it just for an instant moves to the far left, and then as the sun gets higher, it starts moving very rapidly across the entire face. This is just very much in line with each of the marks, showing that this site had been planned and not haphazardly applied.
At the time of sunrise, a ray grazes the notch on the left side on Christmas Day, a feast day of the Church, the first season of the year, the season of the blessed advent of the Saviour, Lord Christ. Behold, he is born of Mary, a woman.
I'm one of these very fortunate people who has been able to work on both sides of the Atlantic on what is sometimes referred to as the Ogham controversy. I've had the advantage of working with people like Dr. Powell. I've also had the advantage of working with the top people in Ireland to try to bridge the gap between the different types of Oghams you find in various sections of the world. We're now standing at the mound at Delft. These are megalithic symbols which were put in probably about 3000 BC to 2000 BC. That was long before the Celts arrived. The Celts arrived about 2,000 years later. They thought these mounds were the homes that their gods and the fairies and everything lived in. They also added marks such as right here. Now this is the early type of Ogham, because later on Ogham was used to develop vowel marks, but initially all the northwestern European languages simply wrote, as most languages do, just in consonants. And this is some of the very, very old stuff which was written before the later materials developed. Now down in here is a rebus very similar to the one which you can see in West Virginia. The type of Ogham that you see in here, and that's sometimes they call it stroke writing, bears a great deal of resemblance to the ones I've seen all through the different valleys there in West Virginia particularly, and I've seen it in other locations also. Here we are standing at the foot of the Caha Mountains on the Barra Peninsula in County Kerry in the southwest corner of Ireland. Nearer to us is a cave known as Pluas na Scríb. On the walls of this cave are the same type of writings that we find in the caves in West Virginia. These writings were made by monks, and this is a system of writing which they used.
We're located at the Dingus petroglyph site in southern West Virginia. I had excavated the petroglyph site in 1988, and it was the first in the state. The markings on this stone do resemble very much the Ogham that was used in Ireland. What's really interesting is, as we've seen in Ireland, are crosses in association with the Ogham. Over in the other corner edge of the petroglyphs, we have markings that could possibly represent vowels, as many of the stones in Ireland. What I've noticed in the studying of the petroglyphs in southern West Virginia, that there's always some feature that is very questionable as to whether or not it had a function. Later tonight we'll come back, and in this grooved out, purposely rubbed out area here, and it's very smooth, a shadow forms with a face, and to me it just reminds me of a Irish monk. This first stone is a miniature cigar-shaped stone. It also has an imaginary stem line, as what we had seen in Ireland that Isabel had pointed out to us there at Tralee. This is a stone that has a symbol carved on it as a Maltese cross. And this is very similar to the type of Maltese cross that Brendan had in his pilgrimage. The third stone is also a cigar-shaped stone. It has markings, I guess you could refer to this as a corner edge or an imaginary stem line as well. This bone artifact was found at the Cook site. It's an artifact with a variety of symbols. One of the symbols is very similar to the Ogham in the Book of Ballymote. It's more of a specialized type symbol because it deals with a stem line and marks adjacent to the line, above a line. There's possible runes, Viking runes. There's also other strokes that could be identified as Ogham. I placed the bone needle to the time period of about 500 AD. Cook Petroglyph site is a very important site because it has one of 4 boat rebuses known in West Virginia. There's also crosses, Christian crosses. There are also a delta symbol, the 4th letter of the Greek alphabet. Many of the marks that are featured here are very identical to the Ogham alphabet that is found on many stones in Ireland. This is a boat rebus. A boat rebus is a group of markings that represents a person's name or makes a statement. Some of the marks in the lower part here may represent people. As you can see, it has a boat configuration. That's why we refer to it as a boat type rebus. This boat rebus may represent or symbolize the way the scribes came to North America. Maybe they were the monks that were setting sail around the 5th to 6th century AD. Maybe they were Brendan's followers, or maybe Brendan himself. When a person's researching petroglyphs, one of the things that they do look for is repeat in symbols. There are similar boat-type rebuses found in Equinox, Ireland. I think that this could be the connection to West Virginia to Ireland, Ireland to West Virginia.
After 7 years away from home, a voice told me my last days were near and to sail home to my sister and fellow monks. This land, the voice said, would soon be known to my successors.
Not long after returning home, Brendan died in his sister's arms at Anodown on the banks of Lake Corrib. His dying words were that he be buried at his beloved Clonfert. Today, a simple slab marks what was once a great tomb, no doubt to honor the monk who came to America in 570 AD. His presence and that of his followers can be seen in their Ogham writings, artifacts, kairos, archaeoastronomical alignments, carbon dates, and the Severn voyage. Even before Christopher Columbus sailed to America, he came to Galway to garner faith and knowledge of the legendary monk. Our journey now should be to embrace Brendan, his voyage to the New World, and to preserve the traces of his footsteps. For a DVD copy of Brendan the Navigator, Footsteps in America, call or text 703-370-3785 or contact Mike at nationalartstelevision.com.